Okay, time for another segment in our selection and recruiting virtual lecture, if you will. This time I'm going to talk about interviews. And this is, if you're following along, slide 19 in our Module 5 notes. So interviews, probably one of the most common ways of learning about people and making selections, one of the most commonly used selection tools. Interviews are great if they're done well. And what I mean by well is, are they structured and are they either behavioral or maybe sometimes hypothetical? A structured interview is good because of three reasons. Right? Number one, the questions that you're asking are based on good job analysis and they're related to the job. They're clearly job related. They're going to have good face validity. They're going to have good content validity. They're going to have good criterion related validity. Second thing is everybody gets asked the same question or at least similar questions. So you're comparing people in a more fair way, right? So you have the same frame of reference, right? You're not going to ask one person, tell me how you solved a problem, and the other person, if you were a superhero, what kind would you be? Right? Because that's really, really difficult to compare their answers to that. And then the third thing is, does your structured interview have standardized scoring rules in place? Some kind of rubric or some kind of way to say this person was a 5 out of 5, or they got an 87 on the interview, or whatever, so that you're making it more objective and standardized. And it's not just, they didn't really have great answers, that's a little bit wishy-washy, a little bit subjective. All right, so often structured interviews are behavioral. In other words, you're asking candidates about something that happened to them in their past, which is a great predictor of future behavior. Sometimes they're hypothetical, particularly if you're dealing with a candidate who doesn't have a lot of job experience. You might ask them, what should you do or what would you do in this particular kind of situation? That's not as great of a predictor of future behavior, but it's a pretty good one. And in some cases, it's hard to ask because maybe you can't ask somebody it's their first job experience and their first interview. Tell me about a time when you solved a management problem. Well, I've never been a manager before. So they're being asked hypothetical questions, right? I would never recommend not to do an interview. People like interviews. Interviews are important. It gives people the opportunity to weigh in on the process. It gives people an opportunity to see if the person that they're meeting with is going to be a good fit for the organization, a good fit for the work team, etc. Worse than doing no interview at all, though, is doing an unstructured interview. And often we find ourselves asking unstructured questions, but usually we're not counting them toward the interview, right? Things like, tell me about yourself. Well, if you were a color, what color would you be? These kinds of questions aren't really very helpful. A couple of reasons why. First of all, the process doesn't have much reliability. It's not consistent across candidates. The interviewers aren't consistent across candidates. They don't have real validity because they're not really related to the content domain, the requirements of the job. Right? And often interviewers don't have a whole lot of training when they go into an unstructured interview situation. They just kind of ask questions off the cuff, and that's not always helpful. So it's great to have a list of questions and some kind of an answering or scoring sheet to use during an interview. And that's something that HR should take responsibility to develop in cooperation with hiring managers and so on. Here's an example of a structured behavioral interview item, and it uses what's called the STAR method. Right? We're talking about the situation or the task that's happening. We're talking about the action that the person took, and we're talking about the results that happen from that, right? And sometimes you'll see it phrased in a very specific three-part way, right? Like this. Tell me about one of your most successful leadership experiences. What was the situation? What did you do? And what was the outcome, right? So we're asking them about their past behavior, right? Hopefully it's going to be a good indicator of what they would do in the same situation in the future, right? We're asking them how they dealt with it and what the result was. And you can see it's got a little scoring rubric on the bottom there. It's pretty straightforward. It's probably a little bit longer than it needs to be even, but it has a three-part scoring rubric. You could say the answer is not acceptable, acceptable, or highly acceptable, right? And you can read the criteria for what that means down below. If it's an answer where they couldn't, I don't have any leadership experiences, right? Or they said, yeah, I did some leading and it was great, right? And that's wonderful. They don't really describe what happened, or they don't describe the outcome, or they don't describe the action that they took. That's not a very good answer, right? And you're probably going to score somebody who answers that way pretty low. It's an acceptable answer. They might say, yeah, here's some specific things that I did in this situation. I did some leadership delegating. I helped the group solve a problem, whatever, right? Maybe they weren't very specific with it, but they at least talked about the right things. They say, well, that's an okay answer, right? A much better answer would be, let me tell you about what I did in this group that I was leading, right? I delegated the work to these 3 people. They were my lieutenants. We solved a problem together in terms of creating a new process that works better than the old process. I helped people to resolve their conflicts. And you know what? At the end of the day, everything didn't turn out perfectly, but I learned a lot from that, and I have used that to move forward in my leadership experiences. So wow, that's a nice answer, right? It's got a great description of the situation, talks about what the person did to act on that, and they had a nice result, and even if it wasn't perfect, they talked about how they learned from it and things like that. So that's the kind of answer that we'd be looking for in a candidate, and it may or may not be, right? But you can design, and the point is that HR or hiring managers, or in cooperation, should design some kind of scoring rubric that they can use to evaluate people's answers to these sort of star questions, if you will. A lot of unstructured interview questions are not good, and they're not necessarily bad. And again, you might use them as sort of a space-filling question, right? Maybe you ask them that question just to hear them, think on their feet, and maybe meanwhile you're filling out the evaluation on the other questions that really were critical to the interview. But some of them don't make a whole lot of sense, right? So here's some examples of real questions that are taken from unstructured interviews from real companies. Maybe you can guess what some of them are, maybe not. Some of them aren't going to tell you a whole lot objectively about the person, right? And people have pat answers for these. What's your greatest weakness? Oh, I care too much. I work too hard. I'm too conscientious. Whatever, right? So they're not that meaningful, and they don't have a lot of content validity. They're not really related to the job, right? They certainly don't have a whole lot of criterion-related validity, because it's hard to show a relationship between doing the job well and people answering the question well, since they don't have any relationship to the job. And in some cases, they don't have face validity. So you might ask someone the question, and they might go, how weird am I? What does that have to do with this job as a bank teller, right? Do you want a weird bank teller, or do you want somebody who's not too weird? What are you getting at, right? So these aren't really very helpful questions, and they can actually throw the candidate off. I think a lot of people think that they're very intuitive, and that's not necessarily the case. So I would argue against unstructured interviews for some of the following reasons, right? People, I can't tell you how many people I've met, maybe you know some of these people as well, and they almost always are old white guys who say, I can tell within a minute, and they always have a southern accent too, so I'm not sure what that's about. I can tell within a minute if somebody's right for the job. I've been doing this for 25 years. Well, you know what? No, you can't. You're good at stereotyping, and we all are. It's human nature, right? But we really aren't as intuitive about reading people as we think we are, right? We tend to suffer from biases, right? We remember more negative information than positive. We tend to be biased toward people who are similar to us, right? We're biased toward people who are more attractive, whether we want to admit it or not. And that doesn't matter gender, male or female, right? It doesn't mean that you're attracted to them, but you might think, wow, this person's really well put together. They're going to be great at this job. And that might not be the case. We're biased towards primacy and recency. So in other words, we might be more biased to remember information about the first candidate that we interview, the primacy candidate, the first one that comes, right? Primacy means at the beginning, recency means at the end. And the same with recency. We might be more biased to remember information about the most recent candidate that we interviewed. And everybody in the middle, well, I didn't remember what they look like, right? So if you're ever going to, by the way, go to an interview and you know there's lots of people interviewing, try to get an early spot or try to get a late spot. So you're either at the very beginning of the process or at the end of the process. And you'll be remembered better than people in the middle. We're biased toward nonverbal behavior. So if your interviewee looks like this, right, or looks like this, oh my gosh, I can't, I'm so sorry, right? You're already disqualifying yourself. And maybe they should, right? But that doesn't have anything to do with how well they can do the job. There's lots of other circumstances that might be happening there. Unequal interview opportunities are essentially discriminatory, right? And they can lead to complaints, they can lead to potential lawsuits, or at least, dissatisfaction. And remember, every unhired candidate is a potential customer. So if you alienate people in the hiring process and they don't get hired, all they're going to do is badmouth you on social media, right? And that's not necessarily a great situation to be in this modern age, right? So one of the things to think about is, are you more concerned about making sure these people fit culturally, or that they have the ability to do the job, right? So you could say, well, they want to make sure that they're weird and fun, because that's totally what we do here. We're the weird, fun company that always has a good time, and we get our work done, but we're always happy and having crazy times. Okay, but wouldn't you rather hire somebody who's got the ability to do the job than somebody who's just got no ability at all, and hey, they're fun and zany, and we have a really fun time together, right? Think about what your priorities are. And ultimately, remember, if your process doesn't help you choose good people, it doesn't have any utility, right? And it's worthless, and it's a waste of your time Probably a waste of theirs. A couple more things we're going to talk about really quickly. On 23, references. Certainly, people ask for references from people who are going to give them a good reference, right? And why wouldn't they? You're not going to ask somebody who's not going to give you a good reference to give you a reference. Most recruiters and resume readers consider references to be better when they're longer and when they have more specific behavioral examples. In other words, if you can get somebody to give you a reference that's long, not 5 pages long, but certainly more than a couple sentences, that's probably going to be more meaningful. And if it has specific behavioral examples of things that you did when you were working with that person, it's probably going to mean even more, right, to the recruiter or to the interviewer or whatever, the person who's hiring you, right, the hiring manager. A lot of people say, well, our company doesn't give much information in terms of references because there's always this fear that it could lead to liability, right? I said bad things about the candidate, and then they came back and sued me and said, you defamed me, right? You defamed my character by saying I wasn't a good worker. Whether that's true or not, they can still come back and sue you, right? But there's some things that can protect you from that, and that's what we call conditional privilege, right? Your liability as a reference giver is limited as long as you meet these 4 criteria, right? One, that your reference information giving is truthful, right? That you can back it up, that it's documented, and you're not just saying, oh, Kathleen, let me tell you about Kathleen, right? You say, well, here's some documented information I have about Kathleen. She was written up twice in her time here for insubordination. She was written up as tardy 6 times in the last 3 months, right? And you have this documented, so there's not much that you can argue with there, right? If the reference is given in good faith, if you're saying it not intentionally to harm the candidate, but hey, listen, I want to make sure that you're fully aware of what this candidate was like when they worked for us, right? And you're not saying, oh, I'm going to ruin this woman because she's so horrible, right? That's not the intent. The intent is, can you inform the new company so that they're making an educated decision? Number 3, that it's made for a legitimate purpose. So if someone calls you and asks for a reference and says, hey, can you just confirm that Jason worked there? And you say, Jason? Oh boy, right? That's not legitimate. They're not asking you to go into a whole diatribe about whether he was a good employee or a bad employee. They asked a very specific question. All you have to say is, yes, this is when he worked here. This is when he was let go. That's it, right? And the best thing you can do is to get the applicant's permission. In other words, while they're still working for you, have them sign something that says, I understand if I ask for a reference from this company, this is the information that will be given out, whether it's my hire date and my termination date, whether it's my job title, whether it's how much I was making, whether it's whether there are any write-ups, whatever. And as long as they sign off on it, if they come back at you and say, hey, you shouldn't have told the new potential employer that, you can say, well, remember when you worked for us and you signed this document and gave us permission to give that information to that new employer, right? They don't have much of a case in that case. So that's a good way to protect yourself. And last of all, let's talk about contingencies. We call them contingencies because typically you have to offer the position or the job before you give these different contingencies, right? Background checks, pretty common nowadays, especially for high security or high sensitivity jobs, working with kids, things like that. And it used to be difficult to get all this information consolidated because there are so many different law enforcement agencies. The federal government didn't share with the state and local government. But now, after the Patriot Act in 2001, we see more of that, and that's working better. So we have more coordination. Remember that you should only consider convictions, and also, according to recent legislation and recent court decisions, you should only consider convictions on a case-by-case basis. And I think that really makes sense, right? Unless it's a job where you can't have a criminal record, like police or FBI or whatever. If it's a job where you're not going to be around the general public, you might consider, well, this person was convicted of a crime when they were 19 years old, and they stole something from a store, and this was 30 years ago, and they didn't go to jail, and partly the record was partly expunged or whatever, right? That's a lot different than saying, oh yeah, I see you have some convictions for armed robbery, 3 or 4. Yeah, you're probably not going to hire that person, but you're going to consider these on a case-by-case basis. And often you'll see that on an application, right? We'll consider your conviction on a case-by-case basis, but please don't lie about it because we'll find out. Drug testing is another contingency, and often people ask, well, should I test pre-employment? Should I test after the person gets employed? And I would say you're better off testing later on, right? Because if you're testing before employment, that gives the person a fair amount of time to stop using drugs, right? And then if they take the drug test and they pass, they can start using again, right, until they get caught. So it doesn't really do a whole lot. In some cases, of course, you need to drug test, right? Now, some of it's by law. Department of Transportation requires it for truck drivers and commercial drivers. I think schools require it as well. But in some cases, it just doesn't make sense, and it may not be worth the price of drug testing before employment. And finally, medical, physical, psychological exams. These kinds of selection tools might be important if it's a job that involves public safety, right? If being a certain physical health or medical health is important for you to be able to chase down criminals, right? Or carry 300-pound people over your shoulder downstairs in the case of a fire or whatever, right? But in most cases, you're not going to want to do these because there's the potential that you're going to uncover information about someone that you don't want to know. That may be in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that's all for this one, and hope you got a lot out of it. The next one will be information on the assignments that are due before our next class meeting. So take a look at that one.